Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Last week, I was invited to a talk by the Macdonald-Laurier Institute about a lot of the things that are going on with that institute, and it ended up being a really interesting conversation of what's going on around the world. And the gentleman that led that was Jonathan Berkshire Miller, who is the Director of Foreign Affairs, National Security, and National Defense at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. And he was talking about how Canada is really losing some of its stature internationally. And we talked about a lot of the geopolitical issues that are going on around the world and the role that Canada could be playing and should be playing and is not playing. And so I thought it'd be interesting to welcome onto the show and chat about a little bit of that. Jonathan, welcome to the show, sir.
Thanks so much, Brian. It's a real pleasure to be back on, and thanks for highlighting these issues and also mentioning the event from the Institute.
You're welcome. My honor to have you back. So tell me, you started out by saying that Canada's stature is not what it used to be. How and why?
Well, I think from a couple starting points here. I mean, often when Canadians think about their stature internationally, I think we immediately pivot back to a period during the Cold War, especially, we herald our history, for example, in peacekeeping. And one example I'll leave you with here on this is, even if you think of the Canadian Foreign Ministry back in the days when it was the External Affairs Department, the current construction of the building, Brian, if you've been there, is shaped like a sphinx, and often tour guides in Ottawa will point to this. Even that at the heart of Canadian foreign policy is this idea, of course, the Suez Crisis, where Canada played a role there under Lester Pearson. It encapsulates this vision of Canada as this sort of this somewhat neutral party who can provide international public goods, but won't find itself entangled in some of the most great power politics events that we see. What we argue at the Institute, and we're seeing it quite clearly now with Russia's brutal war in Ukraine, with tensions in the Middle East, and also tensions in the Indo-Pacific with the strategic rise of China, is that Canada is like every other country. It has interests. Our geography has sheltered us in many ways from those interests, of course, with our neighbor to the south. But we're starting to find that geopolitics is coming back to Canada. We can't avoid, we can't insulate, we can't sit in our castle and pretend that these issues don't affect us. And I think what we've seen, whether it's a malnourishment on defense spending, for example, or a lack of seriousness on national security, or even, frankly, a very forward-looking diplomatic viewpoint, Canada has been behind the game on this. And while other partners in Europe, for example, Germany, Italy, et cetera, are also guilty of this, they're starting to catch up. And Canada still remains, a laggard in many senses. So this is kind of the starting point. And we feel as the years go on and as some of these tensions get worse, that Canada is in a really vulnerable position. So that's sort of a good starting point, maybe, Brian, for the conversation.
But I guess I still have to ask you why and how. Is it because our economy has not done well and we're not, part of the G7 anymore, even though we are, but we're, some people think a G19 or a G16 or something like that in the actual size of the economy? Is it because we're not spending what we should from a NATO commitment standpoint on military? Is it because we're just not playing the role because we're not seem to have the gravitas that a Pearson or a Pierre Elliott Trudeau had? What is the cause of our lack of stature internationally?
Well, I think there's a number of different factors, and I should say, I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head there at the end on leadership, and this is not pure reflective of the current leadership, although I think we are very much lacking in a foreign policy sense anyways on leadership abroad, but that's been a challenge that we've had for several administrations, frankly, in Canada. Showing to Canadians and signaling to Canadians that what happens internationally matters for Canada. It's not a sort of an elective thing. It's not something you should, if you pick up in a grocery aisle and you say, do I need this? Maybe I do, maybe I don't. But foreign policy and international affairs is an essential ingredient. And I think that's the first thing. It starts at leadership. So trying to explain to Canadians why this matters for them, why things that happen abroad are going to have direct impacts on the kitchen table, not just for folks like you and I who are interested in talking about foreign policy, but for average folks. So I think that's the first point, is seeing this as an everyday issue. The second point, I think, is that the globalized world has shifted a lot since the days of Pearson and the days of Trudeau Sr. And some of the things that happen abroad, whether it's international trade issues, whether it's the use of economic coercion due to the globalized trading environment, have made it that we cannot insulate ourselves like we did in the past. And my final point is that's true on security issues as well. Canadian citizens are living abroad more than any time in history. And we've seen this in previous situations where we've had tensions, for example, in Lebanon or Sudan, and we've had to quickly evacuate Canadian citizens. The point I often stress when we talk about challenges abroad is that we may see it as a international problem, or a Sudanese problem, or a Lebanese problem, or maybe a Taiwan problem in the future. But the reality is this can be very much a Canadian issue. We have Canadian citizens who live abroad, and each Canadian government has a role to protect those citizens. And I don't think we have the capabilities or frankly even intent at this point to do that.
But is it really a problem? You know, we're separated from the rest of the world by two huge oceans. We've got the protection of the world's superpower just to the south of us that we're reliant on for shooting down weather balloons and other things, and is going to protect, we think, our sovereignty. I saw a speech by Donald Trump from this past weekend where he was saying that NATO had to spend more because we didn't need to do it in the United States because we're separated by a big ocean. So if we have these natural barriers and the protection of our big brother to the south, do we actually need to play a role internationally?
So I think it's a good question. I think, it's good to fixate a little bit on the United States. And without sort of getting down the rabbit hole of what happens next year in the election, I should note that, the United States, like many other countries, evolves over time. I think their interests remain constant, and I think their interest in North American security will remain constant. So therefore, in a pure hard sense of national defense or protecting Canada, I think it's in the United States' interest, and I think it will remain in the United States' interest regardless of what happens next year, or regardless of what happens, I think, in the next 10 to 20 years. So I think from one sense, Canadians can feel some relief in the fact that I think North American security is an enduring security interest for the United States, which helps us. But I think one of the challenges is that as we see the United States starting to retrench on some of its international commitments, and that some of the elective things, some of the elective reasonings on why that they should care about engaging with Canada, and we've seen this firsthand, for example, on our trade agreement, the renegotiated CUSMA, or Canada-US-Mexico agreement, that the United States can play hardball with us, and they increasingly will play harder and harder with us on many of these issues. And one thing I would note too is that ahead of these elections, we'll find in July the 75th anniversary of the NATO summit, which will be held in Washington, D.C. And as we all know, NATO is going through a challenging time now with Russia's war in Ukraine. So just put yourself in the shoes of Washington, the last large summit before election period, between potentially Joe Biden, who may be running for re-election, and then and maybe President Trump or someone else from the GOP. They're going to be asking allies such as Canada to be doing more. And it's clear that we don't have so much of a plan to do this. So I think that those pressures that we've resisted for some time, that we felt secure in, are changing. We are in a comparatively better position than a Germany or a Japan because of our geography, as you mentioned. But we are not immune, I think, to these shifts.
We're going to have to take a break for some messages. I want to come back and maybe do a canvas of some of the issues that are around the world, and the role that you think Canada should be playing versus the role that they're currently playing. And I also want to ask you a little bit about whether there's a tug of war in the Canadian government right now between those that want to take a far more mercantilist and or aggressive stance versus those that might be a little bit more idealistic in their stance. Stay with us, everyone. We're going to take a 2-minute break and be back with Jonathan Berkshire Miller from the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, talking about geopolitical interests right now and Canada's role therein. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Sagan 860. We're chatting tonight with Jonathan Berkshire Miller. He is with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. He's the Director of Foreign Affairs, National Security, and National Defense at that institute. I heard him speak last week, and he did an incredibly good job of really putting into perspective Canada's role. And I saw an article that you. I guess commented on and had a role in writing called "How Geopolitics Caught Up with Canada." What's that all about? How do you mean geopolitics caught up with Canada?
Well, I mean, this article, which was written by the Financial Times, I think looks at a number of different incidents. I mean, of course, one of the most recent ones was our relationship with India, of course, which has been challenged now with the allegations, of course, of an extrajudicial killing that the government of Canada announced that the government of India might have had a role into. In addition, of course, the China relationship, which has been plastered all over the news for the past few years with the detention of our two citizens arbitrarily, the situation with Huawei, for example, and next generation networks. These are two examples of it. Other examples, of course, are the war in Ukraine and many other tensions around the world, including now the conflict in Gaza. And I think the challenge is that it's not that things happen in the world and Canada is immune to this, but the fact that we have been caught off guard on many of these issues and haven't been able to adequately prepare ourselves. I think this is most acute, of course, in the Indo-Pacific. We were very much overmatched, of course, in our tussle with China over these 3 years. If this was the United States, for example, would they have waited over 1,000 days to be able to get their citizens back? I think that that is very questionable. And the second thing, we're basically a year out now from developing an Indo-Pacific strategy, which is a strategy for Asia, frankly. And now we have two parts of the Indo-Pacific, India and China, which we have adversarial relationships, and not only the two biggest countries in Asia, but the two biggest countries in the world. So I think that the framing of these things that have happened in recent years is a sort of encapsulation there that Canada, as I mentioned when we saw each other, Brian, can't be all things to all people. It can't be all friends to all people on all issues. And I think that cold, hard reality is starting to, formulate in the last few years.
But in your post, you said Canada's lack of seriousness on foreign policy, defense, and national security issues has been a slow burner for many years. We've really been not serious on foreign policy, defense, and national security. We haven't taken it seriously. Seriously, we haven't taken it seriously.
Yeah. So again, I mean, just to highlight a couple of data points here. On national defense, having a GDP spending percentage of 1.3%, which now in the G7 context, if some of the commitments from, for example, Germany and Japan, which have made significant commitments to increase their GDP percentage spending, Canada would be the lowest in the G7. Everything is not a pure money game. Of course, the Canadian Armed Forces stepped up quite significantly in Kandahar during Afghanistan. They're currently leading one of the battalions in Latvia, bolstering the eastern flank of NATO. So we have taken some initiatives, but for a G7 nation, not to be able to stand up like this, I think, is significant. And one other example I'll point to is the recent instability in Haiti. When U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken met his counterparts in Canada last year and asked the Canadians to stand up in the Western Hemisphere, with the U.S. basically dealing with everything else in the world, being the primary backer, of course, of NATO and the Ukrainians to reclaim their territory. Now, of course, deploying aircraft carriers to the Middle East, being the primary deterrence provider in the Asia Pacific. They had a simple ask to the Canadians. They said, hey, we're just pressed. We need you to fill in and to step up in Haiti. And I think effectively we pushed that off. So there are repeated examples of this. But I think on the not seriousness side, part of this I see of the way that we formulate ourselves and the way that we think of our comparative advantage often is not on the security front. So for example, when we go to a lot of these countries, we talk about values, we talk about human rights, we talk about multilateral institutions. I'm not saying they're unimportant, but we're not sometimes seized with the issues of the day. Again, I'll point to Asia here as an example. You could have went to Tokyo, Seoul, Hanoi, Manila, maybe 20, 30 years ago and talked about trade for 90% of your time. But geopolitics has caught up with that region really fast. And Canada hasn't caught up with the trends of the region. They haven't, provided that reassurance that they can be a holistic partner. And sort of a last point, and this, I guess, is more of a technocratic, bureaucratic point, but I think is still important and reflective of this lack of seriousness, is that how can you be a serious nation when you, A, don't have a foreign policy? And I say that not in a polemic way, but I say that in a sense that we don't have a foreign policy white paper strategy that has been developed in several years. We also don't have a national defense strategy for several years, with all of the things happening, like Russia's war in Ukraine, many other tensions around the world. And we also have a very far out of date national security strategy, over 10 years out of date. So, I mean, that shows to me something when all of our allies have, some of them have produced 2 or 3 national security strategies in that period of time, if not more. Yet we seem moreless.
You don't think we have a national foreign policy strategy?
Well, we don't. I mean, I think it doesn't mean that we don't have ideas and that there aren't strategies around it. But we don't have, for example, a white paper, or, I'll point to, for example, the Japanese in the G7. Each year they publish a diplomatic blue book. Some of it sort of gets recycled from year to year, but they articulate in that very clearly, number one, what their interests are, where their interests are, what they're doing on those interests. Now, I'm not saying Canada doesn't do good work abroad or doesn't have areas that it promotes consistently. But when you have a blueprint, that allows you to sort of drive the car in the way that you want to drive the car, rather than being tossed around the ocean, for example. And I think there's a lot of this reactive being tossed around the ocean, where something happens in Gaza, we got to react. Something happens in, with Russia's war in Ukraine, we got to react. So I guess my point is not to just write strategies just to do so, but when you have that blueprint, which we don't have, you end up being, at the mercy of the world events.
So Chrystia Freeland, our deputy prime minister, made a speech, I think it was in the United States within the last half a year or so, where she was laying out, I thought, a foreign policy strategy that was less idealistic, more reasonable in the current geopolitical environment. Do you not agree?
I thought that was a very good speech, if it's the same one that we're thinking about. I think it was at Brookings Institute. And I thought it was a really good speech. I thought it was really clear-eyed. I thought it was really precise in many ways. It wasn't perfect, but I think that it had a good encapsulation. I mean, some of the challenges, frankly, is that this was, as much as great as Christie was at that moment, is that this was done by a deputy prime minister, a finance minister. It wasn't official policy. It was contested and sort of backtracked by things that have been moved by other people in cabinet, and including the prime minister himself. So this goes back to this issue of leadership. It's great to have individuals in your cabinet who are very passionate on foreign affairs and can articulate themselves in the way that I think Christie did at this point in time. But when that's not the game plan, that's not the policy, things sort of fall apart a little bit. And some of the things that she's articulated in her speech, that I don't see that as the go-to policy that Canada has conducted since then. I'll just give you one example. I mean, she talked very hard line on decoupling, with the Chinese economy. Minister Champagne also sort of reiterated that point. And I think Canada hasn't taken, steps in that direction. I think it has very slowly started to realize that it needs to de-risk from some of the economic ties with China. But I don't think Christie's doctrine, for example, is the foreign policy that we're driving right now.
So, what do you think the foreign policy with China should be? Some people are very worried about, what China might do in regards to Taiwan, particularly given the world's attention in either the Middle East or Eastern Europe. What's the role that we should be playing right now with China, and particularly in regards to Taiwan?
So I think a couple things. I mean, and sort of going back a little bit to the Indo-Pacific strategy and the thought process of why we needed that strategy. I think on one hand, you'd have some analysts and some commentators who might say, well, look, China's been a huge problem for us in recent years and the world. But we have felt it quite acutely with our citizens being detained, et cetera, which I talked about before. Let's craft something strategic so that we can deal with increasingly sort of China. That could have been one of the rationales. The rationale I had been pushing for a while was a little bit similar, but I think different in important ways. It was that, in order to balance the rise of China, we actually need to engage with parts of the Indo-Pacific and Asia that share our interests more concretely. So what I'm trying to say is the sequencing is different. It's not that China is a problem, therefore you need to engage with Japan, South Korea, India, etc. But we should be engaging with countries like Japan, South Korea, those in ASEAN, because it's in our interest to. And of course, it helps balance out our ties and engagements in Asia, but it's not a function of containing China. And it's also not the main reason that we're engaging those countries. So I think that's a first point of, it may seem to be sort of skirting around how we deal with China, but I think you can't engage with China when you don't think about the entire region. So I think the first point is thinking about our Asia engagement and not siloed, focused only on China or even mainly on China, but thinking about the region more diversely. The second point is you can't cut China out of a map. Of course, China is a massive part of the Indo-Pacific, a massive part of the world. There are going to be opportunities where it makes sense to engage with China. There are international governance issues that we do need to work with China. China's one of the largest emitters of greenhouse gases, for example. We need to work with China on climate change. We need stability in this part of the world, so we need China's cooperation on issues such as North Korea, for example. So we do have to work with China. But I also think the lessons of the past few years should show that we need to be much more clear-eyed with China. It doesn't mean that we can look at this relationship with the sort of tendency that we did before. And that tendency really was one side, we have economic and trade, make a lot of money, everyone gets really wealthy. The second side, we have national security, and maybe we'll let the Americans and others deal with that. I think I'm simplifying things, but I think effectively this was how we ran our China policy for several years. And many of our Western partners also did. So we're not the only one. The Aussies did for a while. Many in Europe did. But things have changed. And we're starting to realize that you can't just have your economy and trade and investment on one side. Everybody gets happy and wealthy. And then the national security on the other side. They're increasingly interconnected. And that's an area that I think we need to focus a lot in the China policy.
But Jonathan, what exactly could we do and or do differently? You commented about how the United States might not have left two of their citizens in China for 1,000 days or something like that. But it would appear interfering in our domestic elections. What can we do about that? What can you do about such a strong economic powerhouse that seems to not really care about what you have to say?
Well, I think it starts with, it's not easier at home, but at least one of the things about doing things at home is at least you have some levers of control. So let me start there first. I think at home, whether it's on foreign interference, whether it's on election interference, first of all, I think we need to get to the bottom and shed light on everything as much as we can that has happened, that is likely to happen. And I think, it's been a difficult couple of years for us, obviously, with the reports of election interference, of course, with the Michaels. But I think the value of this, and one of the things that hurts foreign interference, is actually shedding light on it. So we're going through this process now as a country where we're looking at this. Of course, we're in our second inquiry now, which the report I think is due out in February. Hopefully, this will shed some more light. but not just illustrate. Then it goes to the next steps, like what can we actually do? I'm thinking that there's going to be some proposals there for legislative changes. This could take many different forms. It could be modernizing the act for CSIS, for example, to have more powers to monitor foreign interference. We could also be looking at changes to the criminal code. We could be looking at a Foreign Influence Registry Act, which is something some of our allies like the Australians and the Americans and the UK now have in place. So these are just a few things we can do at home. Abroad is a bit more tricky. It's easier to reassure your democracy, even though the Chinese will continue to exploit those openings. But when it gets abroad, I think this is where we need to work in tandem. I think we need to work with what I often call a mini-lateral group of states, which would be those who share our interests, such as Japan, Australia, the United States, South Korea, and we need to push back on these things, whether it's economic coercion, whether it's some of the territorial disputes we see in the region. We need to bind together and say there's certain things that are unacceptable. I think it's a lot easier when you have 5 or 6 different states and democracies rather than just Canada going out on a limb and saying China, don't do anything over Taiwan. Or don't do anything in the South China Sea. So I think, those are the 2 sort of game plans we need at home and abroad.
But it seems almost as if we're being, taken advantage of or being taken for granted. China, it would appear, is interfering in our elections. In India, if we believe what the Prime Minister has said, is actually coming into our country and assassinating people. And so these 2 large countries seemingly don't care about what we have to say.
Yeah, I mean, it highlights a bigger issue of the vulnerabilities that we have built into our society. I mean, you could talk even capabilities and capacities of law enforcement, intelligence to monitor some of these issues. I talked before about the need, maybe legislatively, to modernize some acts to allow intelligence, the ability to have stronger monitoring and ideally even prosecution in some of these cases. So I think there's a number of things that you see, and I think you're right. I frankly think the positive thing of the most recent announcements and allegations, of course, from India, and also what we've heard several from China, is that we're starting to wake up to these challenges. And talking to a lot of professionals who have been in this field for a long time and have seen things that don't get reported in the media, is that a lot of these things have been going on for a long time, and it's not limited to to India or China. I mean, there's other actors. The Iranians, for example, have been very active in foreign interference and influence activities. I don't think have gotten the attention probably that they deserve. So it is a big worry.
I think that the American request for our involvement in Haiti, from a small standpoint, and Ukraine's request and NATO's request for assistance in Eastern Europe is a big example of our lack of preparedness, and is a huge wake-up call. Anyway, why don't we take a break for some messages and come back, and I'm going to ask you a little bit about that. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're chatting tonight about Canada's foreign policy, where Canada stands in the world. Our guest is Jonathan Berkshire Miller. He is Director of Foreign Policy and National Defense for the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. And I heard him speak a week ago at a Macdonald-Laurier Institute event, and he did a really good job of putting in perspective where Canada is today. And frankly, I came away quite discouraged about where Canada is today. Encouraged about you and the role that you're playing, but discouraged about the frankness that you described. And so let me ask you a couple of questions. You talked earlier in our show about Haiti and the Americans asking us to play a role. I spoke with a military expert in Canada who said, Brian, we just couldn't play that role. There was no way. We don't have the military capabilities that we could play that role. And if we tried to, there would have been no one left to do anything for a national emergency or any kind of national offense in Canada. We would have it would have just overreached what our capabilities are, and that was the best proof that we've underfunded, under-resourced. And it was actually interesting. The comment was that resources are one thing, from a hard asset standpoint. But one of the biggest issues was lack of human resources, and that were, tens of thousands, if not over 100,000 people short in the Canadian Armed Forces. Can you address where we are in a commitment from a military standpoint to the defense of Canada and our NATO and other obligations worldwide?
Yeah, I think, Brian, that's a really good point. And I mean, so, in some senses, we talked about maybe Canada not wanting to engage in the Haiti mission for other reasons. But I think you're right. I think that at the end of the day, it's not that the Canadian Armed Forces would say, hey, we're against doing this. Of course, if the Prime Minister asked them to do this and they come up with a positive recommendation, that they would end up doing it. But I think it comes down to capacity, capabilities, and resources. The mission in Latvia now, which I think is a really important one for Canada, and one that we've bolstered, although we have to realize that as well, I think is pretty much the maximum we can do at this point. We're still cycling through some of the challenges post-Afghanistan, if you can believe it. And Canada doesn't have the capacity to do many of these missions at the same time. If you want to get even more worrying, so I think, from a pure human resources perspective, I think one of the other challenges that we face is the fact that recruitment has become very difficult. Not only is it the challenging number of staff that we have right now in the Canadian Armed Forces, but getting that recruitment to the optimal levels, being able to keep them, being able to ensure that you get the best and the brightest has been a very, very difficult challenge. And then you have to get the equipment that they can utilize and use. So there's many different examples we can point to. Obviously, the F-35s, for example, fighter jets. It took a long time, and finally they're apparently on the way. But the one that I find is the most shocking is in the submarines. So for the Royal Canadian Navy. So we are a 3-ocean country. We are a Pacific, Atlantic, and Arctic nation. And at the current time, we have 4 submarines. And one of them is being repaired. And with the ratio of submarines to, being maintained versus being deployed, usually that being sort of 1 to 3 or 1 to 3.5, that basically ends up to the fact that we kind of have 1 or maybe no submarines active at any given time, depending on the rotational schedule. So that should concern me when it comes to a national defense perspective. Again, we can talk about the Atlantic and the Pacific as someone else's problem, but the Arctic is ours. I mean, that's a sovereignty issue as well. So I think there's a lot of areas that need to be addressed. And my last point on this is, as I mentioned earlier, is that other countries have been very slow to awaken on this too. So Canada can take some silver lining in the fact that we're not the only one who has been sort of asleep at the wheel for a while, but the others are waking up. Germany and Japan as clear examples of this. So Canada really is one of the last ones in a liberal democracy unit who big liberal democracies who is still asleep at the wheel.
Let's turn to the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the role that Canada is playing or isn't playing or should be playing. So we have this operation in Latvia that you talked about. We've been training some people. We've been donating and or providing some military equipment. Some people think that this is a real war between democracy and authoritarianism. It's the rule of law versus imperialism and expansionism. That it's a fight that we really should contribute to. How do you feel about it, and are we playing the role that we should be playing?
Well, I think, if we look to the future of this conflict in, even frankly, in next year or in 2 years and 3 years, but definitely in 5 and 10 years, and the way that Russia's invasion of Ukraine pans out. So are the Ukrainians able to reconstitute their territory? Is Russia effectively going to, number one, in a maximal term, which I don't think is going to happen, but are they able to, seize even more territory? Or number two, create a stalemate frozen conflict, which is basically what they've done with so many other parts of their periphery, like Georgia, like Moldova. What sort of scenario does that leave the Western world? What scenario does that leave NATO? What scenario does that leave Western democracies? I think it's a terrible one. And I think that's why that's why everyone's fighting here. Whether it's through ammunition, whether it's through political support, whether it's through sanctions, is that they realize this recognition that the Ukrainians are not just fighting for their own territory. Of course, it's their main job, but basically they're the front line against a very revisionist, a very well-equipped Russia, even if economically, not as strong as it was at the heyday of in its Soviet Union days. That they're the front line, and the Europeans have been complacent for many years, and effectively are allowing the Ukrainians to lead this fight. So I think if we fail in Ukraine, if we allow one of those A or B scenarios that I mentioned, either Russia having a significant victory, which I think is less possible, or the fractured victory, I think it has disastrous consequences for us. First and foremost is that those consequences won't be limited to Europe. I think that states, of course, across the globe, especially China, are watching this scenario play out. Yes, Ukraine is not a treaty ally in NATO. It's not a treaty ally of the United States. But with everything happening and everything, the context here, they will see this as a failure of the West. They will see this as a failure of the United States' ability to deter if the Ukrainians fail. So I think a lot's at stake there, and a lot's at stake for Canada too.
Jonathan, as you look at the world, and you take a look at what's happened in Hungary, in Italy, I think in Argentina recently, certainly with Putin and his attack and in Ukraine, and frankly, Liz Cheney this weekend with a book coming out and saying that effectively Donald Trump, if he's reelected, will never leave office. He's a dictator and authoritarianism. Is democracy at risk in the world today?
So I think democracy has ebbed and flowed over the years. So it's in one sense on a take a deep breath sort of a glass half full sentiment. I think that there have been hills and valleys with democracies before. They've traditionally reacted in unpredictable ways, especially as the economy shifts, and the economy has been shifting deeply. Of course, I think we haven't. We were still getting out of a lingering pandemic. Of course, we have Russia's war in Ukraine, the energy shock. So there's many factors here that have sort of made changes, the reasons why electorates have made changes on the political side. That being said, I think one of the things that we need to keep in mind is that the digital landscape and the technology landscape has really changed the game on perceptions of democracies. So back in the day when, trying to influence your electorate was basically a domestic game, you knocked on doors and you tried your hardest to earn votes. Nowadays, it's a digital game. And not a digital game that respects borders. So where I'm going on this is that we have a lot of players in the world, and especially some of them that we've already talked about, that have two interests in mind. Number one, to stay in power, and I'm talking with the Russias and the Chinas and other authoritarians. And number two, to find ways to divide and to weaken any efforts or any attempts that would weaken number one, which would their firm grasp on power. So they see, of course, a united, strong West as a potential challenge to their authority. So what that has led to, and in many of these elections, is of course influx of disinformation, influence online. Maybe you've made the wrong decisions supporting the Ukrainians. I mean, Ukraine is not an issue on a ballot, but basically this is an open season. For digital disinformation. So I think this is a big factor. I think we're probably going to see it in our election as well. We're going to see it in Taiwan's election coming up. So I don't have a full answer on this, but I think media literacy is a huge one that I think we really need to focus on.
You started out our interview by talking about the role that Canada played in the Suez crisis. I guess that was, 75 years ago or something like that. Is it relevant to Canada what happens in the Middle East? And if so, do we have any dream that we could play anything close to the role that we played in the Suez crisis?
Yeah, I think it's going to be tricky in the sense that, you know, how can you keep peace when there's no peace to be kept? I mean, I don't want to be so cynical and pessimistic, that, you know, that peace is completely out of reach forever. But I think at this point in time, we're dealing, I mean, to give context, we're still dealing with a brutal, vicious terrorist attack. And I think with everything that's happened since, and, you know, I'm not downplaying the loss of lives in Gaza, et cetera. I mean, we dealt with a horrific, you know, terrorist attack on October 7th, children, elderly, and that factor still has to be dealt with. I mean, Hamas still has tenets of power in Gaza. So I think the idea right now of talking about peace and the idea that Canada could come in and be a broker, I don't know that we really have two warring parties here. I think we have the Israeli state who's trying to root out a known terrorist organization that's been labeled a terrorist organization by several governments. So I think that's the first one. But the second one, just quickly going back to this Suez sort of mythology, is that, you know, Canada thinks back to this time, but as I mentioned, Brian, the evening that we were at together, I often think the 50s and the 60s weren't nearly as peaceful as we tend to remember. We still had bloody conflict. It's not to say peacekeeping was irrelevant and you know, unuseful, but often it didn't solve many of these challenges. And we see some of these challenges to these days, yet yeah, some of them aren't as violent, you know, Cyprus being one example, but they have not gone away. So, you know, I'm not sure that Canada has the ability to play that role. And my last point on this is that maybe 75 years ago, we were able to carve out a space for us to say that we were Western, we were North American, but we were a little bit different from the United States. I think increasingly when I travel overseas, people see us not as a you know, a lapdog to the United States, but they see us very much in the American Western camp. And I think as societies get more and more polarized, the idea of a country like Canada playing the neutral broker role, I think, becomes much more tricky.
Jonathan, I've really appreciated chatting with you in the past and tonight, and enjoyed reading some of your papers. If people want to follow you, is there a website that they can go to or something where they can get your information more readily?
Sure, they can. My website is www.jberkshiremiller.com. And they can follow me on Twitter. I'm at JBMLLR.
Excellent. And I presume papers are published as well on the Macdonald-Laurier Institute website?
Absolutely, yeah. So Macdonald-Laurier Institute, you can follow on Twitter, and then please check out our website as well.
Excellent. We're going to take a final break and come back with some concluding comments with Jonathan Berkshire Miller in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight has been Jonathan Berkshire Miller. He is a foreign policy expert. He's got a resume that it would take me the rest of the radio show to run through about all of his credentials and backgrounds and experiences. So I won't do that. But I can tell you this man, who is the Director of Foreign Affairs and National Defense with Macdonald-Laurier Institute, is well educated and very experienced in the sectors that he's involved in. But Jonathan, I want to ask you if that's all that relevant. I met a guy and interviewed him who was an intelligence expert, and actually two of them that were commenting on some of the leaks from the intelligence security establishment in regards to China and some of the other issues that have come forward in the last little while. And the comments were that intelligence in the intelligence sector and foreign affairs and sort of Canada's role in the world is just not respected in Ottawa and in Canada. And one of them said, you know, we just don't have the same sort of attitude to CSIS that we would to in the United States they would have to the FBI or the CIA, and that, you know, we wouldn't have a national security advisor like Kissinger that would have the kind of role in a cabinet that would exist in the United States that would never exist in Canada, and we just don't respect foreign policy and what's going on around the world. How do you react to that, sir?
Yeah, I think it's a fairly accurate depiction. I mean, I think our framework of engaging in foreign affairs is just so different from the United States. I mean, even if you think about the traditional National Security Council, which was one that your former guest referenced, and a traditional national security advisor. I mean, we don't. That's staffed by dozens of PhDs and other people who have been studying this for a long time. But we don't have anything. I mean, basically, we've announced this year actually the creation of a National Security Council cabinet meeting, but it's not a National Security Council like we're talking about with the U.S. model, or some of our allies have this too. It's basically a few ministers in the prime minister meeting and saying, hey, what are the problems of the day and what should we be doing about them? So I guess my point is that, and this goes to the national security culture and foreign affairs culture, is that to have a real in-depth, cerebral way of thinking about these issues, you need to build it over time. You can't do this overnight, but you actually need a farm team. It just can't be the principals who are making the decisions at the end of the day. They have to have the good advice. Of course, there's bureaucracies and lots of bureaucracy already in Canada, but I think a coordinated sort of system on national security makes a whole lot of sense.
I'll leave you with a few thoughts. I think that we need to meet our NATO objectives of 2% of GDP, and if we can't do it right away, we've got to have a plan to achieve it over time. I think that we need to have an attitude that is less idealistic, less putting on costumes or national dresses and appearing at ethnic functions, either domestically or worldwide, and really think about what are the policies that Canada wants to achieve in those different parts of the world, and how we can achieve them, and have the right interactions with those people. And I think the last thing is, we do have, I believe strongly, a very unique role to play in that we are one of the most diverse countries in the world. We've got people from around the world that live here. 50% of the people in my listing area in West Toronto have lived in Canada for less than 10 years. Our diversity is diverse. Other places might be diverse, but our diversity is very diverse, really, truly around the world. And so therefore we have contacts with bridges to everywhere in the world. And we should and could be exploiting that and utilizing it, not just for trade, not just so we can watch great soccer games and get good cultural events, but to advantage us all from a role that we can play in our society to make, hopefully, our world a better place. Anyway, Jonathan Berkshire Miller, thank you so much for joining us and educating us all a little bit about where Canada stands in the world, or doesn't stand, and where we should be. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Brian. Real pleasure.
That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thanks for joining. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online from Indo-Pacific, from Eastern Europe, from downtown Toronto at www.saga960am.ca. Good night, and thank you, Jonathan.